Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ed Manlove, and I am the QA Automation Supervisor at the RTS division at Dealertrack. And I'll be talking this evening about the work done by various members of the community in the area of testing AngularJS websites. So I want to get a little bit, I just want to know a little bit about maybe who's in the room. And so since this is the last day, the last talk, I want to do this in a little bit of an exercise ways. So if anybody, if everybody in this room, if anybody has done any work or currently doing any work with Angular, could you please, in any fashion, could you please stand up? I want to force you to stand up, so I know you got your laptops. Please go ahead and stand up. All right. So, stay standing. So it's an exercise to keep everybody awake at this hour. So if you are only doing testing, so if you're only doing, development, if you're only doing development, please sit down. Everybody else stay standing. All right? So if you are only doing testing, please sit down. Rest of you stay standing. All right? If you are not doing test-driven development, so if you're not doing test-driven development, go ahead and sit down. Is anybody still standing? It's tough to see with the lights, but looks like nobody's standing. All right, so just an encouragement to start thinking about test-driven development. All right, thank you. Just wanted to make sure everybody's listening closely. So I have started posting notes and some references and other bits of information up on my GitHub site. You'll note that this link will be here up on the screen the entire time. So if you are interested in getting more information and looking at some of the things I'm talking about, feel free to check out my GitHub site later on. Angular, for those who don't know, is a web application testing framework based in JavaScript. Basically, developers are using it to easily create dynamic websites. And one of the strengths of Angular is that it's designed to be testable. So they've made it, particularly designed it to make it testable. Internally, the Angular team uses Karma for its unit testing of the framework itself. But for end-to-end testing, it uses something called Protractor. Now, Protractor is built on top of WebDriver.js. So this is important, and this is a good thing. So you could kind of think of it as WebDriver, WebDriver.js plus. So it's adding on top of WebDriver. But one of the problems is for myself and maybe other people in the community, we work in languages other than the JavaScript binding for WebDriver. There might be Java, I work in Python, so some of you might work in other ones. So it comes to a problem. But let me get back to that dilemma in a moment. So we have Protractor is built on top of WebDriver.js. And thinking about that, you might ask, so what does Protractor give us in addition to WebDriver.js? And I would say all of this. And break that down. You see things such as some added functionality on top of WebDriver for doing conditions, some validation type checks, things with something called a promise. How many people know what a promise is? Talk about it a little bit later. All right, so a few. Some things dealing with elements. But as they like to say on TV, that's not all. Also provides you this. And you look in there, we got two major lists. One is a lot of locators. So Protractor is starting to add on some extra locators on top of the WebDriver. And there's also this kind of broad category called browser, which seems to add some functionality in there. So again, I work with Python, and I need to test an Angular website. So I asked myself, well, can I just do the same thing that Protractor is doing, but do it in Python? So what I did was I kind of went through these two lists, stripped them down, and said, what is this really in here, and what's really important to me? And so when I pulled it out, this is what I pulled out, and let me highlight it. So what I saw that Protractor really gave, and what I thought I really needed, was kind of two main categories. One is locators. So these are locators for elements that are specific to Angular. Angular, again, is a JavaScript framework. It is, has a bunch of functionality in there, and it's written in this language, you know, for Angular testing. So you got this testing framework. It's got this specific structure, and in there they have these terms such as a binding, a model, a repeater. So we're developing with these items and these elements, so why don't we test and look for those elements by the same way we're developing it? So there's kind of these locators, Angular-specific locators, and then there's also this functionality, this wait for Angular. Interesting enough, if you actually go to Protractor's homepage, as it was a couple of weeks ago, and read on the bottom there, it talks about three things. First thing is what I was talking about. It's designed to be testable, and it's designed to be, Angular is designed to be testable. Protractor is here to help you, so it helps you with testing. Second thing it says there is, it says that it supports Angular-specific locator strategies. So this is what Protractor gives you. And then the last one talks about waiting. It says, you no longer need to add waits and sleeps to your test. Protractor can automatically execute the next step in your test the moment the web page finishes pending task. And that's actually a pretty bold statement, a really bold statement. So again, when I looked at the core functionality from Protractor, this is what I saw. Some locator strategies and some functionality for waiting. So let's go ahead and look at this. So I said, all right, Protractor does it. I want to do it in Python. How am I going to do it? Let's go through those. First one, now, I was promised I wouldn't do this, but I did it. I'm showing code. It is the last day on the last talk, and it is also just after the beer tasting event. So please do not read the code. Look at me. Look at me. Do not read the code. But you'll note, so this is Protractor code. Again, this is written on top of WebDriver.js. So what type of code is this? JavaScript, yes. Everybody say that after me. JavaScript code. JavaScript code. So I don't know how long it took me to realize this, but I finally realized, I said, wait a second. If this is JavaScript code, why can't I just basically take this code, go to Python, my Python binding, and say execute script, which is our method for executing JavaScript in a synchronous way over in Python. And that's just what I did. I basically said, let me steal that code, take that code, I'll put in some variables for the specific binding I need, and then I'll make a call out to execute the script. So here is what I did, which is, let's just do that. And this works. So this is basically saying, in, go back up. In Protractor, what they're doing is finding an element. They're finding it by bindings. They give it a little bit of information. This is a binding I want. And they go out and get it. So I'm doing the same thing. I just say, give me this binding, and it returns back the elements. So interesting enough, not only was I doing this, it turned out that somebody else was doing it. This gentleman here is, his name, if you don't know him, is Paul Hamlet. And what really surprised me was it turns out that Paul is actually the co-author of the Selenium 1.0. I didn't know that when I found his blog post about the work he had done. He had done this, I did my port about a year ago. He did his port 2 years ago. I found Paul just recently in about the past 4 months. But here is his code. Doesn't include the Java that says execute the script, but he's doing the exact same thing. So for me, it was really good to say, all right, I'm on the right road. I'm heading down the right direction. I am thinking maybe the same way that other people in the community are thinking. So we can do this method. Let me skip over this, and I'm going to come back to this. Little side trip for you. So we've talked about AngularJS and Protractor, both being, AngularJS being testable, Protractor being the end-to-end testing framework for AngularJS. There's been some interesting developments of recent note. I don't know if you noticed, again, I told you don't read the code, and now I'm telling you read the code, that I had commented out a little bit of the Protractor code. And let me expand that out. When this is the Protractor code, it's going to find bindings. And the first thing it does is it basically asks this. It says, oh, wait a second. Go check with Angular and say, is there this thing called get testability? And if so, go ahead and return back its own method for finding bindings. I'm not sure it has much relevance yet, and I haven't looked at this. I actually just discovered this probably about 3 weeks ago. I was back in the code looking at it. I'm not sure if this has much relevance to my work and changing what I need to do, but it's just something to note that the Angular side is putting in more of its testing in itself. So just a side note there. So we've got our bindings. One type of locator. Second one, model. Same thing. Protractor code. What kind of code is it? JavaScript code. So what did I do? Very similar method. Here's Python. This is what I did. But I took a slight difference here. When it is looking for model, it has many different ways of describing a model. Basically, a model is an attribute in an element, and there are many ways of giving that attribute name. You can do ng-model, you can do ng_model, you can do data-ng-model-. So there's a lot of different ways. I actually pulled that out, and you'll notice what I'm doing is going through Python first and then going down to JavaScript. Slight difference here, not a big deal, but it's important when it comes into play here. So those are the first two locators. Last one is a repeater. So let me give just a brief explanation of what a repeater does. There's kind of two types of repeaters within Angular. There are simple ones and there are complex ones. Simple one is something like this. I have an array of objects, and I want to take that array of objects and put that into maybe a list, an unordered list in my HTML code. So a simple repeater says, let's go through these objects in the array and make a list out of them. A complex repeater takes more of a template, it says I have almost a matrix of items. I have a lot of major items, and each of these major items or these objects have, sub-data on it. So here's a repeater. I've got a list of transactions, so I want to repeat through transactions, and then within each transaction, I want to repeat through some data on that transaction. So this is kind of, basically, if you think about this, looks kind of like a table. And so when we go into the Protractor code, I made it really small so you can't read it and fall asleep. When we go into the Protractor code, it is working on this idea. You can go in and get by row, by column, or by cell. So this is a repeater. Hold on a second. I'm just going to pull this cable. Okay. See if we can make that flickering go away. Apparently not. All right. So this is how Protractor has it. Again, one big JavaScript code. Paul, in his Java work, did something very similar. He is trying to work with his Java code and makes basically an execute script, goes out, does the same thing. You're starting to see a trend here. I took a little divergent path. I work in Python, so I thought to myself, well, I want to put a lot of this in Python. In addition to that, I was doing something different. I work not only in Python, I also work in a framework called Robot Framework. It's a higher level language that uses natural language. And I needed my repeater locator, but I wanted to specify this idea of a row versus a column versus a cell. So to myself, I was thinking, let me put this all in Python so that I can work with that code, so I can get the rows, I can get with the cells, I can get with the columns. And basically the only call that I make is the execute script call when I'm going out and finding elements, which is part of what it's doing here. So the question is, how did that work out for me? Well, it turns out it becomes problematic. And it is problematic in one particular area, and it's when you're searching by column. If I search by row, it's very easy because essentially row is the highest level that you do a repeater. A repeater says, let me repeat through these rows. And a complex repeater, it says, I'm going to repeat a template. So it sees a template, and it knows each template is basically a row. So it can very easily find a row. If I search for a cell, it finds it very easily too, because it basically searches for the row, and then it searches for the column in the row, and it does that by a binding. So it just says, I know I'm a given row, go look for the binding in this row, and that's my column. But when you are searching by column, it does something different. It says, give me the binding, find the binding, and now we're going to go searching through the entire tree of this entire repeater, looking at every brother, sister, mother, father element, and try to find the other bindings of this type in there. So I had this working, looking good, sent it off to my team. They used it, and they came back to me and said, well, Ed, the repeater's taking some time. And I thought to myself, well, okay, what's a couple minutes maybe? You know, if it's really worthwhile, what's a couple minutes? I said, how long is it taking? It's taking us about 45 minutes. So, this one's under construction. And I think that was kind of what I was doing wrong, was that I wanted to work pretty much in the Python world. And instead, if I basically did what Paul was doing and what Protractors was doing, and instead make, I think, a single execute script call and let WebDriver handle it all on its end instead of me handling on my end, we might come up with different results. So it's kind of one of the things that is a work in progress, but also just a cautionary note to everybody who might be doing this. So quick step back, and I did want to note this, and this is also another important point. I did actually test it, and so what I did was when I looked at testing what I did, I said, well, I'm borrowing the Protractor code. Why don't I just borrow the Protractor tests? And that's what I've done. So essentially, Protractor has its own checks on its code to make sure that Protractor is acting the way Protractor should be acting. So they've got a set of HTML pages, its own website, internal website that it checks. So I basically grabbed that entire folder, and then what I did was I worked in a Python server. So I slightly modified my Python server so that it adds in some extra functionality that Protractor did with its testing server, basically some timing issues and some other functionality. And then I looked at Protractor's tests. It's all in the folder. It's in a spec folder that checks to make sure that Protractor is acting the way they expect it to do. And I found those tests that were relevant to the repeaters and the wait tests, and I just basically rewrote them. Here I'm writing them in Robot Framework. This is kind of what Robot Framework looks like. So I have a set of tests doing that. So I recommend anybody who takes a port of Protractor and ports it into their own language that they go ahead and do the similar thing of grabbing basically you'll just grab the HTML code. You can grab their server if you want to grab their server, or if you're more comfortable with a server in your own language, you can grab that. You have to modify it a little bit. And then look at their test and see what they do. This is basically just a kind of a almost complete repeat of what they're doing, just to check. And I would also note that I'm going to add some more complex repeaters in here so I can see some more issues, so I can make sure that I'm not repeating those issues that I came across before. So we have our 3 locators, by binding, by model, by repeater. And interesting enough, you can actually even use XPath. You can do a find element, by XPath, where some of the elements are using their attributes. Here's an example. You can use ng-click. I have found that it works on some of the attributes, but not all the attributes. So careful about what you do there. I also know that there different languages and different browsers, even though they all are the same. I've had some reports of differences in XPath, so it might not work for you, but if you need to, you could actually use XPath too. So I'll note, Paul and I were working separately and actually really independently and didn't know about each other's work. Paul didn't do a model by model locator, but Paul did do something else that I'm going to highlight here. He did this working with model. He added in a couple other extra functionalities into his Java side, where he is looking at taking a model and either setting the value on the model or grabbing the value of that model. So this is another good idea for anybody who's working with Protractor in a language other than WebDriver.js. So actually, as we're talking about languages, I wanted to kind of take a pause here and do another exercise. Want to go through kind of our languages. Anybody who is working with Java and Angular, if you could please stand up. Anybody doing Java world? Do I get anybody standing up? No. It's tough to see, so you guys can tell me yes or no. The lights are very bright. All right, I don't see any Javas. let's go through the languages. I had them written down. I'm going to skip one. How about any PHP? Any PHP users? No? Python. See Python users? Can you stand up? I'll go ahead and. All right. I was gonna have just if you could take a second to look around and notice who this. So afterwards we can talk some more. Just if you're having issues, you can start talking with people. Okay, go ahead, sit down. I'm going to skip, if I can, Ruby for a second. Any other languages people are using in their Angular that I might be missing, other than Ruby? Any Ruby users? Okay. So I didn't want to single you out too much, but it turned out during a lunchtime conversation today, I found out that there are other people in the Ruby world, in the Selenium world, who are doing AngularJS or trying to work in Ruby testing AngularJS. I have not had yet a chance to look through this code or put this link up on my GitHub site with all the references and links, but I'll go ahead and add that in there. So that's interesting note. Ruby's doing it too. So the other major functionality that I looked at was this question of what's this wait for Angular? As we all know, as we've been talking about for the past 2 days, one of the major issues that people have when testing a website that uses JavaScript is timing issues. So if we think about it again, Angular, designed to be testable. Protractor wants to be testing. What do we got? Well, it turns out there is something that Protractor uses for checking this. Here is Protractor's wait for Angular function. And essentially what you could think of is this is kind of somewhat of a sleep statement. I don't want to connect those too closely because it really isn't. But what it really does, and again, I'm making you read code, but 3/4 of the way down there, there's this part that goes off and it basically says to Angular, notify me when there are no outstanding requests. And this is what Protractor does. This is the key to Protractor's claim that you no longer need to wait for Angular test. Let me give you kind of the brief 2-second first page of a book introduction to what's called promises. I asked earlier if anybody knew what a promise was. Within the JavaScript world, when you're doing asynchronous operations, there are certain times when you need to do something, it's going to go off and take its time to do it and come back, but you don't know when it's going to finish up. So there are different methods for computer science to handle this type of problem, and one of them is this idea of promises, which basically says, I want you to go off and do something, and when you're done, make me this promise that you'll come back and run this code. So this is a major part of AngularJS. It uses promises. You can go into AngularJS website, read all about it, and they'll give you much more information than I can. But interesting enough, what the Protractor developers decided and discovered was that we can actually use the queue within Angular to get out the idea of when Angular is done acting. So this is what Protractor does. It basically goes off and says, oh wait, there's this function down in Angular that says we can find out when all the promises are done. So again, common theme here. Here's Paul's. He does the same thing. He says, well, let me just go ask that thing. Let me go ask that function. I'm going to execute a script. Paul's executing an asynchronous script, goes down, asks for the notify when no outstanding requests are done. I'm doing something similar in Python, but different. I seem to be different in many ways. I go down, I'm making a synchronous call. And the reason I'm doing a synchronous call is that I wanted to not return back till it was done. I've got some wrapping around it that says, hey, if this times out, then I'm going to throw an error. But I wanted to go ahead and say, I'm blocking for it. Still thinking about which way is better, and there might be different situations where one's better than the other. So, and then let me introduce you to somebody else. This is Richard Hung. Richard Hung's also in the Python world, also interesting enough, works with Robot Framework, and he's doing very similar work. He did the same thing, made a asynchronous JavaScript call, goes down, grabs it, and returns back. But he also adds in some of the WebDriver weights, and I think this was kind of an interesting part there. So we've got Angular that goes in and does this. But there's something that's extremely important. Angular doesn't just do this. And as I said, I kind of called it a sleep statement. It's not a sleep statement. What Angular does, in addition to having that wait for Angular, is it says, whenever I go look for an element, I'm going to first wait for Angular. And this is the key to their statement. This is actually the real key to the statement. Think about that for a minute. Before I go find any element, I'm going to wait for Angular to complete. So what's happening is essentially it says, anything I do with Selenium, I need to basically grab an object and act on that object. So I go grab an object, I act on that object, it's going to go off, my web page is going to do something, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to do a validation. But essentially to do a validation, I have to pretty much, for most things, go back and grab another object. So what this does is it says, before I go grab an object, I'm going to wait for Angular to be complete. And it does that by checking the promise queue. So this is kind of the key to it. You'll note that Richard done something very similar for this in the sense of he's taking all of his calls for actions and doing a wait for Angular on there. Slightly different than what Protractor is doing, but this is a very important thing. So anybody who's taking a Protractor, moving it into their language, you want to be thinking about this. And this is what Protractor is doing. And this is why Protractor is successful in what it's doing. Is it's basically waiting before it finds an element. One other quick side trip. Wanted to mention here a couple of people. Al Scott wrote this really good article, and I found this again just a few weeks ago, about the work that he did with Ken Fox and others at a company called Atomic Object. There's a really good article about testing asynchronous behavior in JavaScript with Selenium. Basically, they had the problem that we're all kind of experiencing, and what we're all coming here to talk about, is that we're doing asynchronous JavaScript. How do we deal with timing issues? They're not working in Angular, but they have a really good explanation, which basically comes down to the fact that there are very few things they were doing with asynchronous, and essentially they're doing the same thing Protractor is doing, is they kind of think about it as a queue, and when that queue is empty, we can move ahead. So I wanted to highlight this. It's not quite in Angular world, but again, anybody doing asynchronous JavaScript, you should check out Al's page, and I'll get a link up there on my GitHub site. So what lies ahead? A few quick things. I need to go in and wrap. Actually, I said this because it was what I was thinking, and it's not what they're doing. I don't need to wrap the WebDriver functions and methods with wait for Angular. What I really need to do is go ahead in front of my find elements and put in the wait for Angular. So that's the key there. I want to follow what Protractor is doing, is wait for that Angular. The other thing that Protractor has recently put in was essentially when you would fail a wait for Angular, it would time out and fail, it would basically say, well, we failed. But they came along and realized that we're failing on a queue. It's a known queue. So what they do is they actually go in there and grab everything out of the queue and say what's still left. And they report that out. So now Protractor says, instead of we failed on wait for Angular, good luck, it says we failed on wait for Angular and here's what still you're waiting on. So that's another really good thing that we need to add in, is an explanation. It helps you, it will help you with your testing. Look at what other languages, Ruby, .NET. So what other languages out there? What other people are doing work? There's a Protractor debugger. I threw that up there. I've got big question marks on that. I'm not quite sure I want to do what they're doing, but that's something out there that people might be interested in, Protractor debugger. And one last one, stop animations. This is actually interesting enough within Angular. This is not within Protractor. There's actually a flag within Angular that you can set to turn off animations. So if you have issues with timing or you want to speed up your tests, especially I hear in Chrome, you can actually throw that flag. So that might be another thing in there. So before I finish up, I wanted just to say one last thing. You'll notice, there's a lot of different people. I had a lunchtime conversation today and just found out that somebody's already started to do the Ruby work. So, there's a lot of work out there, and I won't make people stand up. So how many people are doing, I expect most of us, but how many people are doing Selenium for their jobs? Raise your hands. All right, keep those hands raised up for a second. Those of you who know about your company or your organization's open source policy, contributing to open source policy, please put down your hands. All right. So those who don't, I want to give a shout out and encourage you to go ahead and find out about what is your company's policy for contributing back to open source. We actually did this because we had an internal need for testing Angular. And I went through our process, found out what our process was, went through our process, and contributed back to the community. So we're doing that, but I encourage you to get involved. There's been a lot of different talk about contributors and such, but it's really important in an open source community that we contribute, and we've got a lot to contribute. So each one of you is really important. So I encourage you to continue to be involved and continue to get involved more. So I want to thank the sponsors. Thank you all for coming out. So thank you very much. Any questions? Go ahead and shout them out. I'll repeat them. So the question was, how is our transition doing going into testing with Angular, and how well were we with almost the waiting issue and that? It's going pretty well. Like I said, the repeater, when it was hitting the columns, because we have specific things that I want to check columns on, that didn't go well. And then we just avoided that by using XPath. And that was good enough for us, although I want to come back on that. The waiting one has been a mixed bag of results. I think just really is preparing for this talk. I've been going through that code more and more. I wrote it originally, and it's kind of sat there for a while, and now I'm going back in there. And I'm seeing that there are different ways we're doing. We were waiting kind of almost after the fact that we did something. And that's problematic if you think about that. If you wait after you do something, there's always the condition of not starting soon enough or starting too late. But the protractor model of saying we're going to wait and we're waiting before we go to find an element, I think that's the key. They do a little bit of other waitings, basically page loads. They also have some special waiting in there. But I think we're doing pretty well. We're growing, we're expanding it. We have one team that's using it. We have a second team that's coming along to use it. So I think we're coming along pretty well. I'm sorry, are they all? Yeah, so my efforts are all in Python. That's the language we use in Robot Framework. So, and my work, this has been published out there. If you're in the Robot Framework world, you can look at it. I need to publish it probably as a pure Python example for those out there. So I'm only in the Python world. Like I said, so this is why I wanted to introduce the other people. Paul, who's doing Java. It turns out someone's doing Ruby, and I'll post that up there. But as you look through it, it's basically we're just doing something fairly simple in the sense of taking JavaScript code from Protractor and moving it into our world. But there's some things to be careful about, and I think I've hit most of those stumbling blocks myself. So, any other questions? Yes. So the question was, how do I extend the Selenium 2 library? There is, actually let me pull up. Here is, this is actually Richard's. Richard's the one that had done extending the Selenium 2 library. I was using it, so I've done it a couple of different ways. The way I'm currently doing it is I actually put it into the Selenium 2 library. I'm one of the core, well, excuse me, let me clarify that. I forked the library and put it into the library. I'm one of the core contributors to that library, and we were talking about moving it in, but there's been some debate about, because this is a outside framework, whether it should be outside. And so some of that work is in a separate extended library, and there are methods, and we can talk later about how you can extend a library in that. But Richard's also doing that, but he's basically doing it in the Python and using, Python super and extending out the library. So it's basically making a parallel library, and there's some technical details we can talk about on how to do that. So, yes?
Hi, I was wondering what your motivations were to kind of rewrite Angular in Python. Sorry if you covered that.
Yep. No, that's a wonderful question. Basically because, so we're not doing Angular, we're doing Protractor. And the key there was that we're two things. We're not a JavaScript house, so we don't program in JavaScript house. The other key is that we're in Python. We're using Robot Framework. We have a lot of manual testers, so that allows us to have a framework that we can work with manual testers. So essentially, we're not in the language that Protractor works in. We're also not doing extensive test-driven development. We have unit tests, but I think if our developers were doing majority of the testing, if the developers were doing 80% of the testing and QA was automation and doing 20% of the testing, then that would make a lot of sense. We would just say, well, go run off and use Protractor. But because the QA is doing the end-to-end testing and the QA doesn't do JavaScript programming, it was kind of, all right, but we do use this other framework and it's in Python. What can we do in Python? It's kind of it's almost the situation we arrive in. It's interesting because you see, okay, I haven't asked Paul, why are you using Java? It's kind of a similar question. I think it's because I know Java, so.
I just wondering, follow-up, that almost seems like code duplication or functional duplication. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
It does, but it's kind of like, all right, I want you now all to program in Python. All of you, I can't force you to program in Python. And really, it is code duplication, but the key is we're not doing much different. We're pretty much cut and paste the Protractor code out of there. So, in that case, from a programming standpoint, that's probably not the best thing in the world, but there's no... I would think it would be really crazy to take the Protractor, all the Protractor code, import it in, find a way to take, something that makes a JavaScript call to call this over here in Python. It might work very easily. I haven't explored that, but to me it was easier just to say, well, here's a function in JavaScript. Let me take it and put it over here and make this call. And I'm not doing a lot. I'm doing those 3 bindings and waiting. And then outside of that waiting, I am looking at how can I put it at the front end of my find, which should be just one more spot. So I'm only hitting really about 5 spots. Yes?
So, in your research on this area, have you found out Angular or Protractor functionalities that cannot be implemented using the execute script?
No, I haven't looked beyond these, because really when you go through it, if you look at that list, really blind you with a long list. But if you look at what Protractor does, and this list here is actually just, I grabbed this off the Protractor site. This is the Protractor API list. What I did notice was that it seemed as if a lot of the functionality that Protractor did was that this is just extra functionality that they had wished WebDriver did. So instead of Protractor doing this, I think they should shove it down into the WebDriver JS. The bindings in particular, there's things like partial text, button text. I think it was just things that, because they were the developers for Protractor and thought this was useful, let's put it in here. So I have not found anything outside of that. We still have to look at that. How do you properly extend the find elements? But we're doing that all the time with extending Selenium in our different languages. So there's nothing I've found, but I've also not gone looking. Any other questions? Thank you very much. You guys have a good day. Thank you.